welcome back to The Lamppost Listener. My name is Daniel, and this is a podcast where we usually journey chapter by chapter through C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. Today, however, I am joined by Dr. Jason Baxter. Dr. Baxter teaches great books at the University of Notre Dame. He previously was an associate professor of fine arts and humanities at Wyoming Catholic College. He writes on the relevance of medieval thought and literature, and especially on medieval theology and Dante. In his popular writing and lectures, he talks about the arts, travel and literature, technology and humanism, science and culture, and modernity in light of the ancient world. He's an author of numerous books, but his most recent book is The Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis, How Great Books Shaped a Great Mind. Dr. Baxter, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Really appreciate it.
Really excited to have you on. Your book that just came out last year through InterVarsity Press, The Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis, was one of my favorite books that I've read in the last year, and I know that many of our listeners are going to be excited to hear your thoughts right now, but then are also going to be excited to rush out, purchase this book, and get to see a lot of the wonderful things that you have to say. Before we dive into the actual ideas that you present in the books, can you just tell us a little bit more about yourself and about how you came to love the works of C.S. Lewis?
Sure. Yeah, I grew up as a teenager. I was reading Lewis. I think for me, Lewis was my whole entree into the intellectual world, right? Lewis's thoughts on religion and literature and philosophy and history and theology were really my introductory point to everything about a lot of your listeners as well. And so I loved him as a kid. I was I was kind of a devout teenager. It's like one of those, 100 teenagers per year who rebel by becoming more conservative than their parents, obnoxiously so. And I've recovered from that, of the obnoxious part, I hope. And I went off to university and I studied classics, and then I studied medieval studies. And I was doing a dissertation on Dante and his use of Platonist ideas. The reason that's interesting is because Plato, of course, wrote in Greek. Dante wrote in Italian and didn't know Greek. And so the whole dissertation was, how do these Greek ideas get to a Greekless Dante? And there are all these super massively boring Latin texts that transmitted all these ideas. And I was reading all those things and doing some heavy duty archival stuff. And then while I was in grad school, I was also married, I was having kids, and I was reading the Narnia series to the kids when they got old enough. And so I had this funny moment, which I would be going up to the library in the evening and reading like Macrobius or Chalcidius or Pseudo-Dionysius or commentaries of Boethius. And then I'd go home and I'd be reading, Voyage of the Dawn Treader or Silver Chair or whatever to the kids. And I started thinking, wait a minute, this is really weird. There's a strange overlap in this kind of stuff. And one of my buddies who was a couple years older than me in grad school said, dude, you need to keep a notebook of all these things because you could write a book on that someday. And I thought, I guess I could. And as I started to get into it, and I started reading not just Lewis the apologist, not just Lewis the Christian preacher, nor Lewis the fiction writer, but started reading his scholarship, Lewis the medievalist, I was shocked, elated, maybe a tiny bit disappointed that Lewis had got to all the interesting stuff first, and that he knew of this kind of like subterranean stream of Greek Platonic ideas that was flowing through the Latin Middle Ages. And he had read all these books before they were edited, let alone before they were translated. He's sitting around reading these things in the Duke Humphreys Library, in manuscript or in these Renaissance editions. And that's, I think, when my admiration for this man, which was already great, doubled. And so the book is really about how to put all these things together. Is that the Lewis that you love as a teenager, if you're kind of a devout kid, the Lewis that you loved hearing read to you when you were a kid, and the Lewis you love reading to your kids, but then also Lewis the scholar, and how, as I put it in the book, Lewis was successful as an apologist and as a fiction writer, not despite his day job, but because of it, and that's what the book's about.
And in the book, you refer to this as kind of the three different Lewises, exactly, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's just a acknowledged plagiarism, but that's just a plagiarism of his buddy Owen Barfield,
yeah.
right? Who I mean, because he got this sort of like, this like mushroom cloud of success around him. And I think especially when he started getting read by Americans, and the market was just so huge. And they, of course, I think especially in, even though Mark Knowles is showing that the first Americans to love Lewis were Catholics, and surprisingly, the evangelicals are a little slow to get on board, but when they did, right, it was huge. And I think,
Hmm.
understandably, people loved him because he made Christianity feel relevant in an age in which, as he calls it, an age of evil enchantment, in which people had been told for a couple hundred years that to believe in Christ, come on, I mean, just an ancient archaic religion that has a mythological underpinning. You got to update your creed to the modern scientific world. But Lewis made it feel for these people, these simple people of devout faith, was as well as subtle and intelligent people of devout faith, that it was intellectually respectable to be a Christian. So I mean, that's the sort of the obviously
Yeah.
the Lewis we know, the apologist, the writer of fiction, and then yeah, but the Lewis that his students knew, one that Alan Jacobs describes so well in his book, The Narnian, of the guy who was packing out lecture halls, like 200-300 students coming in to hear a man give lectures on, Edmund Spenser's epithalamium, right? I mean, he felt this stuff. It was he himself put it in his lecture, his inaugural lecture when in 1954 at Cambridge, that has the fancy Latin title, the De Descriptione Temporum, or on the dividing lines of history. He said that he was like a specimen. He was a dinosaur, so that even his mistakes would be of value for his audience,
Hmm.
right? Because they would be, at the very least, even his mistakes and facts would be characteristic of the sort of mistakes that the people that he had come to know so well. It's like in his bloodstream. He'd become an expat, except chronologically and not in terms of political countries.
Sure. Well, you mentioned it here as you walk us through these things that make Lewis so unique. On our show, many times we've addressed classical education or great books education, and over the years, a lot of our listeners have asked more questions. Well, what exactly does that mean? So when it comes, the subtitle of your book is "How Great Books Shaped a Great Mind." So how was Jack's education? How was Lewis's education different from the kind of current, postmodern or progressive model of education that we all kind of maybe think of, many of us grew up with, right? How is this different, and how did a love of great books, particularly Dante, medieval literature, how did it impact his thinking? How did it shape the way he viewed the world?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question, and I think this is a conversation, a debate, a symposium, a seminar, a conference, or something waiting to be had. But I think a lot of people in the great books movement, I think Lewis has sort of challenging things to say. I'll just go ahead and put myself in the category to those of us in the great books movement. I mean, I think as a kid, of course, he just read everything.
Mm-hmm.
And he just sort of, read indiscriminately. He says even some books he shouldn't have in his father's library, right? Dad just threw all the books on the shelf and Louis just read everything. But I think his schooling is maybe not quite like how we imagine a great books education, but maybe what we might call a classical education, even though that term obviously is slippery too.
Sure, sure.
But basically, I mean, his education, I just think is, I think in a world before STEM has all of the prestige, then the elite educations, excellent educations were primarily linguistic. And so in a sort of distant way, I think Lewis got a type of like linguistic education, something like what Milton got at St. Paul's.
Hmm.
And like, obviously it begins with the classical languages, especially Latin, but also Latin and Greek. But then by the time he's actually preparing for his exams in 17 under his tutor, really almost the only thing he's doing is just reading foreign languages. He's reading French, he's reading Italian, he's reading Latin, he's reading Greek. Just huge amounts of reading, but developing a type of like incredible linguistic flexibility. So much so that later in life he recommends to moms that encourage your kid to learn Latin well enough that he doesn't have to use a dictionary when he reads it. He won't regret it. Or is writing Latin epistles to an Italian priest and has this sort of this Latin exchange. So I think Lewis would probably, if he were giving a talk to one of our great book school, he'd probably actually strike us as a little snobbish, and that he
Hmm.
might tell us, what's the point of reading the great books if you're not reading them in the primary languages? And I think that would be a fun sort of debate to launch. But I talk about this in the book, but he was so in love with this idea of atmosphere, that literature provides this capacity to not just to know ancient things, facts about things, but to breathe ancient ways of seeing the world. You sort of like listen in on ancient emotions. That in his mind, that carried over into that you have to know the languages, because otherwise you might accidentally be imposing a screen between yourself and the original experience. So much so that when he's doing his own scholarly work, he sometimes translates this 16th century Latin into a kind of 16th century English of his own, because he thinks that basically these thought worlds in felt different, and thus he wants to preserve that type of feeling. But then, then Lewis gets sort of trained as a proper philosopher who, in that time, is either kind of like a historical kind of Hegelianism, or this sort of emerging so-called Anglo logical positivistic approach.
Hmm.
And that's when he gets into the situation in which all these things that he had loved and sort of read on the side, his George MacDonald's, as well as his old classics, his Boethius, his Dante's, all these things that he had read, for fun, for nourishment, these things that he felt were rich and full, now didn't seem to fit into the kind of like meat grinder of logical positivism that he had begun to learn at university. And that sort of produced for him, obviously, this sort of great crisis, which eventually leads to his conversion.
That's really well said. You have this great line in one of the early chapters in your book where you're talking about this idea of landscape, and you write, contemporary neuroscience has proven what Lewis knew in his bones. When reading fiction, we do not use the same faculty we employ while, say, doing mathematics or reasoning through a philosophical proof. Reading fiction is more embodied, and literature creates worlds in which we are immersed, move around within, as if traveling through a variegated landscape where we hear and breathe in ideas that, in other contexts, were merely academic opinions. And I think you're able to communicate what Lewis is actually doing in so many of his works. And that, what I'm hearing from you is that came from himself being immersed in this books, which is why you're able to read the silver chair and see the lady of the green kirtle try to explain, no, Narnia is all fake, and then make those connections between these ideas of evil enchantment that Lewis was doing academically. And I think that's why we find, here on this podcast where we have young listeners. I know we have listeners who are school-age children. We have listeners that are great-grandparents, right? And I think Lewis is able to connect all of that because all of his works, whether they're for the youngest readers or the oldest readers, right, they're
Yeah.
able to still communicate those truths.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's in part because well, and this part of the message of the book is that Lewis, a lot of the most interesting things in Lewis that we love the most are just plagiarisms of the Middle Ages.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I put that in scare quotes, right? Plagiarisms, because he acknowledges them. I mean, you remember that weird bit at the end of Out of the Silent Planet? My 14-year-old just finished it. She listens to it while she's doing the dishes.
Mm-hmm.
And she just came and said, Dad, the end of Out of the Silent Planet was really strange. Who's Bernard Silvestris?
Yeah.
I was like, well, glad you asked. Sit down, and I'll give you a new book to read. But no, I think he acknowledges these things. But I think in some ways he felt that these books were so strange. Well, they weren't even in translation in his day. But even now that they're in translation, look, it would be a very you know cruel college professor to inflict these things on college students, right? I've tried, and this like something like Roman de la Rose or Bernard Silvestris or Alan of Lille or something like that. They're really, really strange books. They think and they feel differently than we do. But I think Lewis spent enough time that he'd begun to develop affection. It's kind of like, when you're married for a long time, sometimes you even start to like your spouse's deficiencies, which used to annoy you. Kind of like them.
Mm-hmm.
Lewis was like married to these things long enough that he started to like their peculiarities, their strangeness, and then I think had the kind of conviction. Well, first as a scholar and as a lecturer, I got to help my students I got to help my students get to the point where they can at least understand why this is not, archaic nonsense, why it's plausible, why it's even attractive. But then increasingly, I think as he began to popularize more and more, I think he wanted to make these ideas accessible to a larger readership. And he did that by means of creating his own fictional world. But in some sense, he's extracting, quote unquote, the ideas from the medieval text
Mm-hmm.
and then re-injecting them almost kind of like, like a Jurassic Park kind of thing, like removing the medieval
Yeah,
DNA
exactly.
and then bringing them back to life in his own works. So Bernard Silvestris, the super weird text called the Megacosmos and the Microcosmos, right? Or in Latin, the De Universitate Mundi, this really, really cosmographia, this really strange text. Um, Lewis involves this fascinating moment in which the main figure has to go on this kind of space traveling expedition to meet the planetary intelligences, the Usiarchs, and then returns. Weird stuff. But then Lewis realized, oh, wait a minute, we all love sci-fi. I can take that sort of same essential theme and then re-inject it in contemporary culture. And thus I can give people a taste, a vision. I can let them breathe medieval atmosphere for a couple of hours as they're in my book.
Let's talk about more about kind of bridging that gap and allowing modern readers to breathe that medieval atmosphere. You throughout the book make references to Lewis as the British Boethius. And we have centuries of history that help us understand, how Boethius straddles the world of antiquity and the medieval world, right? We can kind of much clearly see that in the 21st century. But with Lewis, we're just a few decades removed from his own life. And so what exactly is it? What worlds are being bridged through Lewis in your perspective as you've thought and read a lot about this and written a lot about this?
Yeah, so I think this is one of the fun discoveries for me, and Chris Armstrong has seen this as well. But one of the fun discoveries is that how if you go to the passages in his scholarly books like The Discarded Image, Lewis devotes about 6 or 7 pages to Boethius, and you highlight how he talks about Boethius as this figure of classical learning, like one of the last figures to know to know both Latin and Greek in the Latin West, who, because he was arrested by Theodoric and put seemingly under house arrest and
Mm-hmm.
knew his execution date was coming, was denied his library, was denied all of his grand intellectual ambitions. And he's going to write like 16 books of series of books. And he was going to prove that Plato and Aristotle were reconcilable. And then he was going to reconcile the humanities with theology and the pagans with Christianity. He was going to do what Raphael sort of fantasizes about in the School of Athens, and maybe what classical educators are trying to do right now. He's going to put it all together, right? All of that was cut short, and all the bitterness of that. And he gets a year to write a 80-page book, and it's the Consolation of Philosophy.
Exactly, yeah.
But there's some bitterness to it. His whole project is cut short. He has no library, and he just has to write this thing. And as Lewis says, Boethius didn't have the luxury anymore of going into the fine distinctions. Like, well, what would a Stoic approach be? What would a Platonic approach be? What would an Aristotelian approach to this type of, to temperance be, or something like that? He just didn't have the luxury to do that. He didn't have the luxury to use the surgical scalpel. What he had to do is show how valuable the whole tradition was, the whole thing was, and thus sort of focused on their unity. And he was doing this in the midst of what Lewis, I'm going to paraphrase this slightly, at one point calls loud, boasting, beer drinking, fair skinned thanes. Right. In other words, the barbarians were taking over the mechanism of Mediterranean politics. And thus they weren't, I don't know, they're kind of like us, honestly. They weren't very interested in the intellectual life unless it, could do something, right? What's its political
It had to be
value, right?
useful, exactly, yes.
Yeah, right. I mean, so what, don't bother me with all this, speculative theoretical stuff, right? And so Boethius makes his best case for why this should be saved, and really becomes one of the few um, linking linking links to the classical world for the Middle Ages. when you have that all in mind, and then you turn to these couple of interesting passages where Lewis, drops a line here and there in which how he thinks about his vocation as a writer, you find the same language coming out. For instance,
Mm.
in a lecture on apologetics to a group of clergymen, he talks about his contemporaries as a new group of barbarians. And he says, we're going to have to convert people, I believe, to virtuous paganism before we can make them Christians again. And he himself, even the very concept of what I call the long Middle Ages in Lewis, in which he says, you know what? People from Gilgamesh to Jane Austen essentially had the same worldview, right? Like, these people about, almost 5,000 years, they were all more alike to each other than any of them were to us. In other words, that's
Hmm.
another kind of Boethian move of trying to save the sort of the essence of this ancient tradition. So that was pretty exciting to me. And your listeners will be happy to know they can knock that out in the first chapter of the book, right? And
Exactly.
just to get this idea of the British Boethius, but to see that, and then I guess one other kind of cool thing. At one point, Lewis calls Boethius the divine popularizer,
Huh.
which is also seemingly how Lewis thinks of himself, of taking divine ideas and then vernacularizing them, popularizing them, making them available to this huge audience through the kind of figment of the literary. Just like Boethius imagines a conversation with this well-dressed lady called Lady Philosophy, who has, all these, he kind of uses this vehicle of imaginative literature to try to save as many ideas as possible. So too does seemingly Lewis use his own fiction as a way of saving as many of these ideas as possible, and has done a really great job, best-selling author of the 20th century.
You mentioned that's really well said, and you've mentioned that inaugural lecture that he gives when in 1954 when he accepts that chair at Cambridge. And I know as someone, I probably been reading Lewis for 15 or so years before I found that lecture. And it was one of the things where, oh man, I wish this was one of the first things I had read by Lewis, because it made sense of so many things that he does throughout his writing. And there is, exactly like you just mentioned, that really interesting comment that he makes, this idea that the ancients have much more in common with Jane Austen than we do. Can you tell us just a little bit more about what does he mean? Because I think if someone's hearing that and is not necessarily, has not had a great books education, does not necessarily pick up and read medieval authors, it is hard to think, well, no, of course we have much more in common with, Jane Austen, who lived, in the last 2 centuries, not that much further away from us than Aristotle, who lived 2 millennia away from us. But Lewis doesn't agree with that. Why not?
Yeah, it's such an incredible claim to make, isn't it? Yeah, so I mean, so the whole point of that, he's just been made the chair of medieval and Renaissance literature.
Mm-hmm.
And he says this is an amazing step progress because in the past, maybe he's thinking of someone like Jakob Burckhardt. In the past, there was such a strict division between the medieval and the Renaissance that the medieval was considered this time of like kind of how Monty Python portrays it, right? Like all
Exactly.
these
Yeah.
peasants are covered in ugly robes and are like beating mud randomly with sticks and they talk in stupid accents, right? That was the Middle Ages, of course. They're dark ages and people were superstitious and they were liturgical about the most moronic things like rabbits and stuff like that. Um, and then the Renaissance came along and rediscovered ancient Latin and discovered that it was written in a different rhetorical style, and science followed after that. And pretty soon you had light bulbs and iPhones. And us amazingly developed human beings who Steven Pinker, the psychologist at Harvard, says were the most enlightened people who ever existed and were the least violent. Anyway, that's like our sort of story, right? About how amazing we are. And Lewis said, I think it's good that you've already begun to problematize the boundary between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, because only people who are deeply steeped in ideology hold that anymore, right? Students just repeat it because they feel that they're supposed to. But anyone
Mm-hmm.
who actually knows the stuff doesn't really think that anymore. It's been a revolution. Then Lewis asked this other cool question, say, okay, well, if the dividing line is not between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, then where is it? Is it the scientific revolution? Is it maybe the fall of Rome And he proposes a couple of alternatives. And eventually what he settles on is, no, it's somewhere between me and my grandfather's generation. That is somewhere in the late 19th century when we began, when we spent more time around our machines than we did around natural realities. The interior metaphors for how we think of the world and described it changed from natural metaphors to mechanistic metaphors. And when that happened, we started to think about our world and our lives and virtue in the terms of machines. We began to sort of replace a sense of honor with professional productivity. I mean, like, can you think of like a greater compliment in contemporary society than to call someone professional, right? Or to call an athlete productive, as if they're like a conveyor belt machine that puts out lots of desirable outcomes. Now, I think obviously this sort of trend has continued. Obviously, Lewis is not in the age of internet and iPhones. Have to wait for Al Gore, of course. But when we talk about, say, I'm sorry, I don't even have the bandwidth to deal with that right now. Or you can think of like, the 42 dozen ways in which our chief metaphors for reality have become our machines, our devices for communication. And we begin to subtly redefine what it means to be happy, what it means to be human, what it means to have a successful, flourishing society. And it's kind of apocalyptic in a way, but it was a silent apocalypse, which occurred sometime over the course of decades. But sometime, Lewis says, in the last quarter of the 19th century. And in that fun essay, which I agree with you, Daniel, I think if you could only read 4 things of Lewis, it would be Weight of Glory, Transposition, Meditations in a Tool Shed, and then this wonderful little piece. Don't be intimidated by its fancy Latin title, De Descriptione Temporum, right? Or on the dividing lines, or on the division of great ages of history, right? The 1954 inaugural Cambridge Address. I think those would be those 4 things because it's such an incredible claim. But you're right, it does make a lot of sense of his very feeling about the idea of evil enchantment. Just to give one practical example, why does this all matter? It matters because, according to Lewis, that all of us have spiritual interiorities. We have souls which are, in whatever capacity, all the ancients say this, are connected with the divine. And this is what we forget. And this is the sort of goal of the spiritual and human life, is to kind of recover this deep sense of connection and thus reintegrate our psychological, spiritual, rational, and ethical powers. And then we become whole, integrated people. Does that sound like a good description of a goal of classical education?
Sure.
But in modernity, in our world of productivity and machines and speed, and remember Eliot in The Wasteland has this line, hurry up, please, it's time. The sense of the anxiety, time for what, right? I just better be more productive. I need to be a better version. We need to be more up-to-date versions of ourselves. I need to download a new programming system for myself. I need to reinvent myself every year, right? I need to get a faster operating system. Then these spiritual longings seem out of place. They seem strange. I don't know why I'm even having this kind of moment of longing right now. I don't even know what it's for. Lewis called it joy moments. But these things are hard to process in a modern world in which we're supposed to be productive and professional and polite and bureaucratic and file our reports on time. What are these spiritual longings even good for? And they seem vaguely and weirdly out of place, such that I feel like a loner in modernity because I'm having these kind of haunted spiritual feelings, Lewis suggests. And that's why meeting these guys, like the Inklings, was such a huge deal for him, because they all realized that they had been, how do we put this, closet, God-haunted souls.
Throughout the whole time, yeah. And that's so tricky to think about sometimes, because I think many of us, as we maybe feel, we might not have the words to describe it in the way that Lewis does, but we feel some of these same pulls. We feel haunted in a similar kind of way. There's this ability to feel very alone in that. You look at the culture of the world around you and you're like, wow, a lot of people are not necessarily thinking this. I do think that the last 2 years, especially after COVID, has there's been more people starting to question this. I think even a little bit in the secular world, just how exactly are we processing our world through machines? But I see this especially with my students. So in my career, I have almost exclusively worked with students 8th grade and younger, and particularly like 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders. It's very different than your college students in many ways. And what's interesting about working in a classical Christian school is the fact that many parents who are sending their students to our schools are already cognizant of these things. They're thinking through, how can we not be ruled by our screens or ruled by, technology in general? But it's so funny because we'll still use that same kind of language. All right, I'll do this even. All right, how can we be productive today? How can we do these things? Or even just using, like you're mentioning, our metaphors and the way that that's communicating subconsciously to children. Children who, I don't think any of my students right now have a cell phone, and their parents have been thoughtful about not giving them a cell phone. And yet the way that these adults are talking in a school that's focused on trying to minimize the effects of kind of ubiquitous technology are still, it's the air we breathe in. And that's what makes Lewis so unique. It wasn't the air he breathed. And I think many of us that love Lewis are just attempting to learn, how do we get to a place where this isn't the world? And obviously, he's incredibly talented. I don't ever want to knock him on just his own gifting. But one of the things that was easier was the fact that he didn't have a little, supercomputer that followed him around everywhere in his pocket, whereas we do. And even if I try to minimize my use of machines, I have to be extremely thoughtful about going out and being a part of the natural world. I have to leave my phone at home, or I have to do these things. It's so hard to break away from this dividing line in history that Lewis mentions, this age of the machines.
Yeah, it's very difficult because, Nicholas Carr, for example, has shown this discussed it, at least in The Glass Cage, that it's changed how we read. It's changed our powers of attentiveness. And so it's really hard for us to sit down and do Lewis sits down he said he at some point he lost the capacity to read unless he had a pencil in his fingers, right? So Lewis doesn't read anymore. He just studies, and he sits down with dictionaries there. And he's able to read for, 5 or 6 hours contentedly, which I'm afraid the reality is that there's a little microwave ding that goes off in our brain, depending on how much time we spend on our devices. But somewhere between 5 and 15 minutes is our attention span, as opposed to 5 to 6 hours. And then if you sit down beyond that, you're just exercising a great amount of virtue. But even very virtuous people these days, can they keep it up for more than an hour? Yeah, I think Lewis would look at us and would almost sort of feel apocalyptic. He would say,
yeah.
he would, I think he sort of envisions us in that hideous strength. But the gospel is written on the human heart.
Sure.
And we shouldn't be surprised when people maybe not get to the truth, but find themselves exhausted, depressed, hungry, confused, discontent, malnourished. I remember when my oldest was a little girl, her grandparents were taking her to McDonald's. Said, "We're going to get you a surprise." Her mother had left her with a very nutritious meal of yogurt and applesauce and this kind of stuff. Organic, of course.
Sure.
But her grandparents were being a little bad and taking the granddaughter to McDonald's as a special surprise. But my daughter, when she was little, maybe 5, started crying like, "No, please, Grandma, please, no. If you go to McDonald's, you'll be hungry after just 25 minutes after eating." And if that's my sort of metaphor for, weirdly, Augustine knew it. Our hearts are restless until they rest in you.
Mm-hmm.
Weirdly, the restlessness, the fatigue, the anxiety, the depression, which is, a problem, obviously, are kind of symptoms of an unfed hunger that needs to be nourished. And thus for Lewis, right, it's this tiny, tiny band of people professors of literature, professors of medieval literature in that hideous strength will save the world. What an incredible thing to do, right? On one side of the equation are all the powers of evil, right? Like trillionaire, international global capitalist, companies that have heavily invested by purchasing the media
Yep.
and have, bribed their way into all these places and have this kind of like pharmaceutical / genetic manipulation / they own the State Department and education. They're gonna, I know, super futuristic, right? They're gonna transform the world, and then there's a band of like like a half dozen college professors of medieval literature and their graduate students. But medieval literature will save the world. It's almost only half joking here. And I guess that's really what the book is about, is how on earth is that the case? What do they know? What do they feel in their bones? What do they breathe? Which now for us is so distant and so strange. It has to be constructed like an archaeological rune, right? If you go to some of these like runes in the Middle East, they're just in shambles, right? You have to have someone reconstruct them to show you what it all felt like. And that's what Lewis does with the Middle Ages.
And I think that's why, for us in education, we find ourselves so incredibly passionate, because it feels like we're in a post-apocalyptic place. I don't mean to just speak hyperbolically, just for the sake of, hey, we're on a podcast, see how important this is, right? But it does feel like the stakes are very high. I mean, I even think, as you mentioned, this dividing line, one of the names that's often around in classical ed is Charlotte Mason, who's teaching, obviously, at that time when the machines are taking over, and kind of, in some ways, in a Lewisian way, is trying to preserve kind of education as she saw it before the age of the machines. And I think we often find ourselves in the world of classical education moving towards both the ancients themselves, the medieval writers themselves, and then the modern writers who were able to translate that for us. I mean, I think for so many people, I mean, I am cliche in many ways that here I am, a teacher in a classical Christian school who also happens to have a podcast on C.S. Lewis. Like, that is extremely normal, in this kind of world, to love these writers. And, the Inklings, Lewis, Tolkien, Barfield, Williams, all of them, and the writers, like Chesterton and MacDonald, who influenced them, they're viewed as themselves as these giants. And they are often kind of the gateway into the greater world of the canon, if you want to call it that. But what's can be really difficult is that because, Father Brown and Bilbo and Aslan are all so much more accessible than a conversation between Dante and Virgil, or between, with Aeneas or Beowulf, right, and Hrothgar.
That's right.
We sometimes have a tendency to stop, especially for adults. I sometimes think it's much easier to hand a child a young student's translation of Beowulf in 4th grade, like we do at my school, and get them excited about it, than it is to hand, maybe even Tolkien's translation to an adult and say, try to figure this out. In many ways, our children's imaginations are already kind of primed to receive the truth found in these texts. Whereas I know often, when I first read, for instance, Homer as an adult. I had read portions of it and stuff, but when I first read it, I approached it more not as that landscape that you mentioned that Lewis is talking about. I approached it pencil in hand as a text to analyze. Whereas I have a translation by Rosemary Sutcliffe that I read out loud to 4th and 5th graders over the years. And my students don't approach it to analyze it. They approach it to live outside the walls of Troy and to be in the battlefield, to follow around these heroes and these villains. And that can be hard for us as adults. Sometimes we feel, at least I sometimes feel this way. I'm like, I missed the opportunity. That's why I became a teacher. I can still get to live in it. I can keep trying to get better at it, and I keep staying in 5th grade over and over again until I can finally learn it. But for some of our adults...
It's a great age.
It's so wonderful.
It's the last age that children are children.
It absolutely is. They're still excited to come to school. They still enjoy school, and it doesn't really start to go away until the next year or so. But Lewis, I think, would be very saddened to hear us say, well, as an adult, I can't really engage with. I can't maybe engage with Dante, and so I'm going to reread Lord of the Rings again. I'm going to reread the space trilogy, and not that those I've reread both of those things.
Rewatch the Star Wars movies.
Yeah, exactly. And so why should we keep going? I kind of have thought about it. It's like, why should we keep going further up and further in, past these kind of modern writers, to the people that they were pointing to? Why should we still read these ancient and medieval texts?
Yeah, that's such a great question. What do Lewis's authors have that Lewis and Tolkien and Williams and the others don't? Well, I think the nice thing is that Lewis would be really gentle with this right here. He says he spent his life trying to persuade his audiences and his students, but also his public audiences, that the great books are more accessible than you might hope. Even though, he has this high definition of knowledge, he still wants people to try, and that they're more delightful, and they're more useful than modern summaries. And so I think he was convinced that a great book, almost by virtue of having been written, in pre-modernity, was more embodied, had sort of rationality of the brain, the fiery passions of the soul, and these longings for something even more transcendent were all held together, and that thus you could go back to breathing. You could breathe more of all of these together than you could in anyone's attempt to try to rationally summarize it, because it's precisely the modern author who's already stripped it down to nuts and bolts. But I think maybe the great value of reading Boethius or reading Plato or reading Dante, despite their differences and despite their historical distance, is it's kind of like expanding. It's kind of like expanding the Eagle and the Child, Lewis's favorite pub where he met with the Inklings, beyond the period of our own particular era.
Mm-hmm.
And that, who doesn't love discovering that a new friend, and every now and then, I think especially when you get a little bit older, you meet these people that you've known for 15 minutes, but you feel like you've loved them for 40 years.
Sure.
If you could do that with respect to old authors, if Plato, as it turns out, is on your side, and Boethius and Dante, I think what it does is, to use old-fashioned language, I think it nerves your arm. I think it gives you a sort of sense of historical weight, that we're the keepers of the secret fire, as McCarthy has it in a particular line. We're the keepers of the secret fire. And what they were transmitting, we're blessed to actually have burned within our own souls as well. Mm-hmm. I think that sense of piety to the past, and reverence and fidelity to these old things, these old beautiful things, and I love them so much that I'm willing to, even to a certain extent, suppress my own personality in reverent humility and gratitude for what I've received. There's this sort of special gift of a great book's education done well. But also, Lewis just points out in Learning in Wartime, look, we have blind spots. Even your favorite authors, even your Lewis and your Tolkien and whatever, your Barfield and your Williams, have blind spots. Mm-hmm. Now, to a certain extent, these guys were very aware of blind spots. We're kind of like going out looking for them and trying to expose them to themselves.
That's the fun of those meetings at the Eagle and Child, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but I think there are some things which I can just give you one example. If you ask someone what purity is, you get a double negative definition if you ask a religious kid. Oh, purity is not engaging in those types of activities until you're married. So purity is merely avoiding something, whereas the ancients had a different feeling about that entirely. They actually saw it as a positive virtue. So there you go. There's at least one sort of like really fascinating blind spot where for us it's just become a legal thing if we even think that we should impose it upon ourselves, which obviously is statistically rare. But even if we do among, certain like churched believers, we don't know what it means anymore. We don't
Hmm.
know why we should love it. We've lost a vision of it. Whereas our ancestors, maybe too much, maybe they overvalued it. Maybe they thought it was, the one most important virtue to have. But nevertheless, I think when you encounter the ancients, you also begin to expose and perhaps explode your own blind spots. Maybe another one that Lewis loves to pick on is how we think that being nice is a virtue.
Yeah.
And thus, but for Lewis, reading his ancient literature, which is not nice at all, would just say, you know what, most of the time, what we call nice is us just being milksops, is us not loving something enough to actually say anything about it. And thus we think we're being all virtuous, but until we're exposed to a love which is so passionate that it exercises fortitude and strength, then we don't realize that we're actually masking a vice and telling ourselves it's a good thing.
Hmm.
One could go on, but those would be, I think, the sorts of things which reading old books could expose you to, or maybe even just to add one more, the thirst and hunger for holiness. It just seems like for a lot of us, Christianity has been reduced to this moral code, but this deep panting desire that my soul thirst for God as the deer thirst for running water. This is what Lewis thought his ancient authors like, ancient 17th century author like George Herbert had taught him so well, but it's something which had also been preserved in George MacDonald.
That's really well said. If someone, and I'm sure many of our listeners are inspired just by hearing what you're saying right now, is about why it's important, the value, the virtue that we can obtain through reading these books. For a listener who's hearing this and says, I've never actually been able to dive into great books. Maybe the most recent, Lewis is kind of as far as I go with old books, in quotation marks. Where would you recommend they start? If someone's hearing this and wants to dive in and wants this kind of mind to begin growing and within them, where do they go next? Or at least first, where do they go first?
Man, I love that question, and I feel kind of heartbroken about it in a way, is because some of your listeners, have already gone through their college experience, and I guess look, the fact is, these books are important and beautiful, but they are hard, and I think reading them in community with a guide.
Yes.
Dante has his guide Virgil, and then Beatrice. We need our own guides. We need to be in community together. We needed to be reading in a like-minded group of spiritually hungry and intellectually hungry people who want to become better people. And then we need a guide. And college, those precious college years, I guess first of all, you could just encourage your your kids, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, this is, you're gonna have 4 precious years to try to become worthy of your royal calling. Don't waste it, right? This
Hmm.
is an amazing opportunity. Okay. But for those of us who have gone through it and don't have that type of luxury anymore, I feel like these are the sorts of people I write for.
Hmm.
These are the sort of people I constantly have in mind. Smart, intelligent, deep people who are, want to be good moms, want to be good dads, want to be good friends. They want to have a heart full of wisdom. They want to be capable of when their friends or children come to them, they have not a platitude, not a cliche, but some sort of truth within, as Lewis said about Tolkien, that cuts, right? That cuts like cold iron. And is that it?
Yeah, and bites like I can't remember what it is, but yes.
Yeah. Burns like cold iron. Something like that. Ugh. You'll
It's
have
on
to
the
figure it
back of
out.
a couple of different Lewis books. Yeah.
Yes. Right. But we want to have something that's for real, that is meaningful and memorable. So anyway, I write for these types of audiences. And so I think my book on Lewis, The Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis, would be an interesting place to start because it would just give you an idea of a half dozen different books that Lewis adored. I also have a book called A Beginner's Guide to Dante, to
Hmm.
Dante's Comedy. And I think that's also written with this same audience in mind. So, I mean, a cool thing to do would be if you can. We live in the age of what one sociologist called the age of bowling alone. And so it's hard for adults to create time to spend together in the flesh and in community. But an ideal version would be get a little group together, maybe read through Dante's comedy. My book, I think, is written for those types of people, helps them not just understand the historical background, but make it feel why it's important. Maybe share some of that sort of medieval air. Dante's comedy is a great place to begin. Julian of Norwich's book, Showings, is a really beautiful and very strange book. I think it's very challenging. She says that on her deathbed, she was given a vision, a crucifix began to speak to her and sort of revealed to her the secret inner truths of Christianity. That's a challenging book. I think if your listeners haven't gotten there, Augustine's Confessions
Oh,
is a
absolutely.
brilliant
Yeah.
place to go. And at least the first book, I think everyone will feel, yeah, I know exactly what this is like. For the first
Hmm.
couple of books, it's very accessible, and then as you go on and on, you'd probably want some sort of guide. Um, Homer's Iliad, though written probably before the Odyssey, I think is probably harder to get into just because there's so much kind of ancient warrior culture, killings,
Hmm.
and trying to steal each other's armor. But Homer's Odyssey, again, I think you probably need a guide because there's some strange bits in it. But that is a brilliant book, which I tell my students is Homer's attempt to do philosophy and to do theology before those disciplines existed.
Yeah.
There are a couple of quick ones.
That's really well said. And again, I think it's, to hear someone with your wisdom and expertise and intelligence recommend, hey, actually pick up a guide, do this with other people. I think in our age there is this fear of, oh, like, because I can pick up a book on my Kindle and read just like fun fiction all by myself, that's how I need to do this, and that's just actually not how most of these books were read throughout most of history. And so hearing, oh, it's actually okay to pick up a guide, or it's okay to be confused and actually want to read this together. This is why we do in education. This is why we rarely, I tell my students, oh, open your book up. We're all going to read chapter 7 silently to ourselves. No, we don't do that. Of course we don't. Right?
Yeah,
We read in community, and what you're doing is encouraging us. So thank you. And I hope
that's right.
that encourages many of our listeners.
Well, I think the ideal way to learn anything is to be around someone who has loved it so well and so long
Mhm.
that he or she has embodied it. I
That's
mean, you're
great.
just the way you talk about sort of teaching your own fifth grade kids makes me think that you're definitely one of these people. If you get the stories within you so deeply that then you can tell them from memory without even reference to a text. Sometimes you have a text, whatever, but sometimes you
Mhm.
don't need it. And you can perform it for people. That's when, in some sense, I think that's when maybe all real education happens, where I myself have embodied it so well that now I can perform it for you. All of a sudden, we're no longer downloading kilobytes of information, but we're actually engaged in a process of formation. That
Wow.
is that is a beautiful thing, and I think it's worth investing in, right? We spend $1 billion to build new football stadiums. In all honesty, I love football. I really do. I love it too much. I'm addicted. All right. I love Notre Dame's football. Okay. Fine. I've admitted it. But the only thing we love in America is our sports. We've got to expand the network of our interest, and we've got to expand the network of our investments. If we begin to spend as much as on our own education as we do on our entertainment packages and our sports opportunities for ourselves and kids, then maybe we'll actually start to see something of a renaissance breaking through.
Hmm. That's a really great way for us to end our time together. So Dr. Baxter, before we let you go, though, would love to know where listeners can purchase and support your work, because so many of the ideas you've shared with us are really just the beginning of longer conversations. And that's always what we hope to do on our show, is to allow people to, engage with us here and these conversations, but then take them out to be embodied with, real people who they're not just listening to in their ears, right? That are actually in front of them, they can see in front of them. So where can listeners purchase and support your work? Because your book has really been the launching point for this wonderful conversation.
Yeah, this has been a lot of fun. So I have a website, jasonmbaxter.com, jasonmbaxter.com, in which I list my books. And I have links to some of my articles and some of my media appearances. But I also have a list of all my books. And with the exception of the scholarly book, I sell all of them on my website. And I'm willing to sign them. It's like through PayPal. So it's, your credit card number is safe. Well, if you trust PayPal, that is. As safe as PayPal can make it. I will sign it for your listeners at no charge, and this gets my readers the most excited. I just reach for whatever random lecture notes I have. I mean, I've been teaching through my grad course in Dante, so I've got random lecture notes here. I just wrap my books in whatever I grab, whether it's scholarly article
That's
reading
so
I'm
fun.
in. And my listeners are thrilled because what they tell me, Jeff Bezos has never done that for them. So jasonmbaxter.com. I also have an Amazon author page. If your listeners want to know when my next project comes out or something like that, then they can, follow me through there, and Amazon will
Sure.
dutifully alert you when the next product is available.
Great. Well, thank you again, Dr. Baxter, for joining us. We're so thankful for your thoughts, the way that you've helped us kind of process through why great books matter and why we should be engaged with them. So thank you for coming on the show.
Hey, it's been even more fun than I had anticipated. Thank you.
That's always good to hear. And before we go, I always want to remind our listeners that this episode is made possible by our patrons over at patreon.com. If you'd like to support the show, you can listen to a bonus episode each month along with other rewards. Special thanks goes to John Marr, Emily Wakefield, and Ryan Smith for supporting us at our top tiers. If you have any listener feedback, particularly about Dr. Baxter and about this show, this conversation we've just had, you can email us at thenarniapodcast@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 406-646-6733. And you can find all of our previous episodes, links, and book information at lamppostlistener.com. As always, we do appreciate reviews wherever you get your podcast because that helps other listeners join together in our read-through. Thank you for coming along on this journey, and we'll be back soon.